listening to the Video Game and Nerd Trivia Podcast with Tony D. Video Game and Nerd Trivia Podcast, your episodic dose of trivia covering all things video games and nerdy. Now, here's your host, Tony D.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Video Game and Nerd Trivia Podcast. As with every episode, we do 30 questions of trivia broken down into 3 rounds. How it works is I'll give you a question and then give you 5 seconds of silence and then tell you the answer. On today's episode, our topic will be Game Boy Advanced. This was actually my first Game Boy device. I didn't have any Game Boys before that, so Game Boy Advance actually holds a really close place in my heart. So today's episode was pretty fun for me to write. And again, we're going to do 3 rounds, so let's begin with round 1. Question 1. What game company released the Game Boy Advance? That was Nintendo. Question 2. Game Boy Advance was the successor to which handheld? That was the Game Boy Color. Question 3. Name one of the 3 initial mainline Pokemon games for the Game Boy Advance. Take your pick, it's Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald. Question 4. How many lettered buttons are there on the handheld? There were 4. That was A, B, L, and R. Question 5. What was the name of the Mario racing game spotlighted on the Game Boy Advance in the early phase of its life cycle? That was Mario Kart Super Circuit. Question 6. How many bits was the Game Boy Advance? So it's interesting, it was 32-bit, the CPU was 32-bit, but the graphics and connectors were 16. So technically, they built it and marketed it as a 32-bit system, but the output you see didn't really reflect what 32-bit was in that sense, in the visual sense of like 3D and stuff. Question 7. What was the handheld that succeeded the whole Game Boy Advance line? This was the Nintendo DS. Question 8. What vampire hunting series released multiple critically acclaimed games on the Game Boy Advance? This was the Castlevania series. Question 9. Did the original Game Boy Advance have a backlight? No, it didn't. It didn't have a backlight. Was really disappointing. I always got those peripherals that, used up your battery life to have more light. Let's see. Question 10. Speaking of batteries, what type of batteries was used to power the Game Boy Advance? Can you imagine? It used AA batteries. 2 AA batteries. Alright. Let's head into round 2. Question 1. How did you pause the boot logo when turning on the Game Boy Advance? So in order to pause the boot logo, you would press start and select at the same time when the Game Boy was booting up. Question 2. What was the name of the upgraded Game Boy Advance with a clamshell design and a backlit screen? This was the Game Boy Advance SP. A little fun fact about SP, it stood for a special project and then later on it just became part of the name SP. And the backlit screen was pretty nice. The other cool thing about the Game Boy Advance SP was that it was the first time a Game Boy system used a lithium-ion battery, so you just had to charge it, but then, over time, the battery kind of dies out or doesn't hold as much of a charge. I had one of those. Alright, let's go to question 3. What year did the Game Boy Advance debut? This was 2001. Question 4. How many years was the Game Boy Advance officially on the US market? It had a 7-year lifespan of a pretty decent support. Question 5. What was the name of the Super Mario series that was basically a series of ports of previous Super Mario games, but this is now on the Game Boy Advance? This is, of course, the Super Mario Advance series. Question 6. What RPG was developed by Camelot Software for the Game Boy Advance following a band of magic-attuned teenagers called Adepts to protect the world of Weyard from alchemy? This was Golden Sun. Question 7. I like this question. What was the best-selling Game Boy Advance game that was not a Pokemon or Mario game? This was Namco Museum with 2.96 million in sales. It stands as number 8, so that's pretty crazy. So just for those who are curious, number 1 was Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Number 2 was Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. Number 3 was Pokemon Emerald. Number 4 is Mario Kart Super Circuit. Number 5 is Super Mario Advance 2. Number 6 is Super Mario Advance. And then number 7 is Super Mario Advance 4. And then number 8 is Namco Museum. Alright, question 8. What was the name of the Game Boy Advance series that is basically a collection of super quick mini games and stars Mario's yellow and purple nemesis? This was WarioWare. Question 9. What game on Game Boy Advance starred Samus and was able to unlock additional content for Metroid Prime when connected to the GameCube with the GameCube Game Boy Advance link cable? This was Metroid Fusion. Question 10. So we talked about this before, but now we're going to this specific game. What was the name of the Konami vampire platformer action role-playing game that was released as a launch title for the Game Boy Advance in 2001? This is Castlevania Circle of the Moon. Alright, let's get into round 3, our final round. Question 1. What was the name of the updated Game Boy Advance that was a much smaller version and had a changeable faceplate? This was the Game Boy Advance Micro. So there were 3 releases of the Game Boy Advance. The original, the Game Boy Advance SP, and the Game Boy Advance Micro. Question 2. What was the name of the format that allowed you to watch certain full-length movies from cartridges that you would buy for the Game Boy Advance? This was just simply called Game Boy Advance Video. Question 3. What was the resolution of the screen for Game Boy Advance games? So this was actually 240 by 160 pixels. Question 4. This is a weird one. What was the name of the blood glucose peripheral that was available for the Game Boy Advance? So this was called the Gluco Boy, and basically it's a peripheral that you put into your Game Boy Advance so that you can measure your blood glucose levels. It was done because it was a way for kids to have a Game Boy Advance to kind of be more compliant with checking their blood glucose. Question 5. Pokemon Battle Arena cards and Animal Crossing cards were available to be scanned into the Game Boy Advance to get certain unlockables or traits. What was the name of the peripheral that was needed to do this? This was the e-reader. Question 6. Yoshi's Island from SNES was ported to the Game Boy Advance. What was the title of the Game Boy Advance version of the game? This was Super Mario Advance 3. Question 7. What was the project code name for the Game Boy Advance? This was called the Advanced Game Boy, that was one of the code names, or Atlantis. So those were two code names that was used for the Game Boy Advance during production, or during development. Question 8. In the original Game Boy Advance release, which color was only exclusive to Japan? This was orange. Question 9. This is a very specific one for you fans of the show Lost, but in the episode of Lost called Exodus Part 2, the character of Walt was playing a Game Boy Advance SP in the airport during Michael's airport flashback. What game was he playing? This was Cabela's Big Game Hunter. And finally, the last question. Which game in the Super Mario Advance series was a port of Super Mario Bros. 3? This was Super Mario Advance 4. So the whole Advance series for Super Mario was kind of weird because their naming was all over the place. So the first Super Mario Advance game was a port of Super Mario Bros. 2. The second Super Mario Advance game was a port of Super Mario World. And then Super Mario Advance 3 was a port of Super Mario World 2, which is Yoshi's Island. And then Super Mario Advance 4 was a port of Super Mario Bros. 3. So it's all over the place. But yeah, that concludes all 3 rounds of questions about the Game Boy Advance. Hopefully you knew some of these and maybe you learned something today. Again, reach out to us on social media. I would try to make an episode of any of your suggestions for future episodes. And again, thank you so much for listening. If you like this episode, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere you're listening to this. It will really help us out. And yeah, until next time, Trivia on.